Good evening, everyone. We have a lot of snow. I looked on an app on Chrome a little while ago called Precip, and it said that Park Hills, um, Precip, right? Park Hills received 12.3 inches of snow. Let's see. No, 11.9 inches of snow. I'm not sure how accurate that is, but it seems like it. So we are actually off tomorrow. No classes and no work. We have a snow day. Anyway, so I want to continue with our study in Matthew, and I will say, let me say this too. I will be gone next weekend. I'll be going home. Um, so I hope that John Jackson will be able to fill in. I have not talked to him about that. But John, if you see this, um, I'm asking you to fill in for me next weekend. Okay, so we were in Matthew 9, and we kind of ended in Matthew 9 last week with the first 8 verses of that. So we're going to take some selected verses from the rest of the chapter. But first, we need to look at a background here. So in Matthew 9, verses 8 through 38, we see here the calling of Matthew as a disciple of Jesus. Now remember that Matthew was a tax collector. Tax collectors, I, I like to almost consider them to be like kind of like the mafia uh, of Israel. They may not have killed people, but what they did was they collected um, taxes for the Roman government, but they typically collected more than what was owed, and they would skim that difference off the top and keep it. So our tax collectors were pretty well off in Jesus' day. They were considered to be traitors to the general Jewish population. Now, in Mark and Luke's account of this, um, he is named Levi, another name, which is not uncommon for Jewish Jewish men, especially, had two names. Paul had two names. His Roman name was Paul, his Jewish name was Saul. He may have used this name um, to emphasize the mercy that Jesus had upon him, because the name Matthew means gift of God. It's entirely possible that that's why Matthew used that name in this particular account. So, because of this, it looks like Matthew is going to host a dinner, a banquet in his home near Capernaum, in Jesus, in honor of Jesus, and he invited apparently his fellow tax collectors. Now, the scripture doesn't say that explicitly, but what it does say is and Jesus reclined at table in the house. Many tax collectors and sinners came to recline with Jesus, and we can just assume, I think reasonably, that these were colleagues of Matthew. Now, for some reason, somehow the Pharisees caught wind of this as they were the disciples of John the Baptist, and Jesus encounters them. We also see some more miracles. Here, some more healings. Jairus' daughter, this is the first time Jesus raised someone from the dead, as recorded in the Gospels. We're going to talk about that in a bit. The two blind men, the woman with the issue of blood, um, continues to heal, and of course, it says um, earlier in the chapter that he continued to do this all through the region. So, what he was trying to get across here, which is the theme of this week's lesson, is that mercy is greater than ritualistic sacrifice. He directed his comment specifically toward the Pharisees, as we'll see in a little bit. The word mercy in Greek is eleos, and the meaning of that word is kindness and goodwill toward the miserable and the afflicted. Jesus wanted to have mercy on those who needed it and who knew they needed it. The ones who didn't think they needed it, he will encounter in a different way. So that's kind of the background. This is kind of a short background that what we're not accustomed to typically in lessons like this. Usually in chapter 3. Really, just the rest of chapter 9. There'll be some events that we will not cover, but are some selected ones that we will cover. So, in Matthew 9, verses 10 through 13, I'm reading here from the ESV, the English Standard Version. And as Jesus reclined at table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? When he heard it, he said, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. Jesus had just called Matthew, one of his apostles, one of his own disciples in the group of 12. Remember, there were, if you think of Jesus' relationship in terms of concentric circles, Jesus in the middle, in the next circle would be Peter, James, and John. They are the three that he takes with the most. That example, they were on the Mount of Transfiguration. They're going to play in this story a little bit too. Then you have the 12 disciples, and then the 70 that he called, and then everyone else. So he called Matthew to be one of the 12. And so, as a perhaps a gift or an offer of appreciation and gratitude, Matthew held a banquet. Now remember, Matthew's a tax collector, so he's fairly well off. So he can afford a large dinner in his home. Now, the account here does not say it is in Matthew's home, but Mark 2:15 says it is in his house. And so he invited most of his tax collector colleagues, as well as other classifications of sinners. Remember that tax collectors, Matthew will state later, ranked at the same level as prostitutes and Gentiles. So there may have been other kinds of sinners there in the room. Well, you've been able to hear me. Guess we'll see when I get finished with this. So there are quite a group of characters in this at this dinner, and Jesus is talking with them and probably sharing what his mission is. So the Pharisees found out about this. Now there are some commentators, and I've read a couple of these accounts, that believe that Matthew had a fairly large house and it may have been quite warm that day, so he opened all the windows of his house so a breeze could come through, and that there were Pharisees who actually were peeking in the window or saw in the window. I'm not saying that we're keeping toms or anything, but they saw through the window what was going on. And then there are others who think that maybe um, someone from the banquet uh, stepped out and informed the Pharisees of what was going on. Um, Clearly, they were not invited, and they may have been a little bit miffed about this. You know that even though Matthew was a tax collector, um, being invited to a dinner would have been something that the Pharisees may have wanted to do just so they could show themselves to whomever. But they may not have done this. They may not have accepted the invitation simply because there were sinners there. So remember, the Pharisees, kind of like the Judaizers in Paul's time, always looking for excuses to stop what Jesus was doing. They always accused Jesus of breaking the law somehow, not the law that God gave, but the all of the regulations that the Pharisees put in under these laws, all of these things that assured that people were following the law. Now, apparently, they they may not have been brave enough to actually confront Jesus Or it could have been that because there were sinners present in this dinner, they didn't want to go inside and become unclean because they were talking with people who were sinners. So they talked with his disciples. I'm not sure if how what they considered his disciples to be, if they considered them to be sinners or not. In any case, whoever disciples, they're probably Peter, James, and John. Um, and so they confronted the disciples and said, "Why does your teacher, your rabbi, why does he eat with all of these people who are classified as sinners, who are tax collectors, maybe prostitutes, maybe Gentiles? There, other classifications of sinners. Why?" Well, Jesus, always knowing what's going on in the minds of the Pharisees, um, confronted them instead. And this is what he said. He said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician or a doctor, but those who are sick, those are the ones that need a doctor." So he was intimating that the Pharisees already believed that they were well, that they were righteous because of their um, legalistic and even uh, zealous adherence to the law, not the law that God gave us to follow, but the regulations that they created to follow. Jesus said, I'm not here for you because you don't think that you're sick, even though he knows, and maybe they knew in the back of their minds that they were really sick. Jesus came for those who were sick, really dead. I mean, the word here, the word for sick, um, is the word uh, ekontes. Sorry, I'm sorry, kakos, Kakos, and it means badly. And then another word is ekontes, um, which let's see, it means that what you have is bad. It's really what that's actually two words there. So um, he came for those who are ill and even dead. Really, I mean, if you take John 3 into account here, and then the other places in the New Testament where Paul says that we were dead, Ephesians 2:1, we were dead in our trespasses and sin. The people who were dining with him that day um, were the ones who fell into that category. They were the ones that needed a physician. And remember, he is the great physician. Then as Jesus was, I don't know that he necessarily enjoyed doing this. I think if those of us who are a little snarky might think that he enjoyed it. I'm not sure that he did, but he chastises them. I mean, listen, when he says go and learn, remember he's talking to Pharisees and scribes probably as well. And the scribes, remember, were the ones who copied and translated the law, and so they knew a lot about the intricacies of the law. But he says to both groups here, so you need to go back to the law and learn this. And here's what you need to learn. Go find it. And it's in Hosea uh, chapter 6, verse 6 says this: "For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." David says a similar thing in Psalm 51. So he says, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. He demonstrated mercy to those who needed spiritual restoration and really spiritual resurrection, if you want to put it that way. Pharisees considered themselves to be righteous, so um, because they were zealous adherents to the law, but in actuality they were sick and they may even been dead too, and it's unlikely we will see any of them in heaven. So that little passage was about Jesus' mission. This is what he was out here to do. The next few verses talk about what Jesus' work is. So this is verses 14 through 17. Then the disciples of John, this being John the Baptist, came to him saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" Jesus said to them, "Can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch tears away from the garment, and a worse tear is made. Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. If it is, the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and so both are preserved." All right, so remember that during this particular period, John the Baptist is incarcerated. Herod incarcerated him, threw him into jail, kept him there until he executed John, had John executed, I should say. And so these disciples of John the Baptist were concerned, if that's the right word, about the disciples' lack of ritual fasting. So both John's disciples and the Jews, the Pharisees in particular, did their fasting on Mondays and Thursdays. And this was according to the regulations that they created. And so it's more than likely that this particular banquet occurred on either a Monday or a Thursday. That's why they were concerned that, well, you guys should be fasting today, not feasting. And so they were asking, why do we and the Pharisees fast? And there's an alternate translation that some manuscripts add much or often. So they were emphasizing the fact that not that just they fast, but they fast a lot, way more than Jesus' disciples did. Now, the only required fast, the only thing that was prescribed by law was the fast that occurred on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. All Jews were to fast on that day. Remember, the Day of Atonement was the day that the high priest took um, a bucket of sacrificial blood, took it into the Holy of Holies, and threw it onto the mercy seat, the lid of the Ark of the Covenant. That was to cover the sins of the people for the year. Um, so, and then the Pharisees, throughout the decades, the centuries, added more regulations about fasting and made this ritual fasting required on Mondays and Thursdays. Now, for the Christian, and this is an interesting concept here, fasting is voluntary. However, it is expected, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. But it is to be done in secret. If we go back here to Matthew, let's see, Matthew 6, 17, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "When you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you." So when you fast, people aren't supposed to know. In fact, it kind of bothers me a little bit when I see people who say, "Well, I've been fasting for such and such." No, don't tell me. I don't need to know that. That fasting is between you and God. I have mentioned Dr. Don Whitney, many times in class, um, and this discussion about fasting made me think about the chapter in his book, um, Spiritual Disciplines for the Christian Life. And you can see this here, Spiritual Disciplines for the Christian Life. Um, he has in here 10 reasons why we should fast. And I didn't list them here in the PowerPoint, but I'm going to read them. Just read the reasons. To strengthen prayer, to seek God's guidance, to express grief. That's what Jesus was referring to here about the wedding feast, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. To express repentance and then return to God, to humble oneself before God, to express concern for the work of God, to minister to the needs of others, to overcome temptation and dedicate yourself to God, to express love and worship to God. So those are the reasons that Dr. Whitney gives that fasting, because Jesus said if we go back in Matthew 6:17, he says, when you fast, he didn't say if you fast. So that really spoke to me, because fasting, to be quite honest, is not a big part of my Christian life, if I could even say it's a part of it at all. So that really is something that challenges me, and I think maybe I need to meditate on that some more and think about that. Now, what's going on here, though, is that the religious people, which would include John's disciples, made fasting into something God never intended it to be. What they've done is they've made it a check the box. Okay, I've done my fasting for Monday, check. I've done my fasting for Thursday, check. So it's not intended to be something that you check off of a list. That's what they were doing here. So to answer their question, Jesus responded with three analogies. One of the lesson writers called these mini parables. So he talks about the wedding scenario. He says in verse 15, Jesus said to them, "Can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast." So he's saying here that one of the reasons that Dr. Whitney says to fast is because of grief. So he says a wedding is not supposed to be a time of grieving. It's supposed to be a time of joy. And the bridegroom is here. Jesus is saying, "Here I am, right here." So we rejoice. But there will come a time when the bridegroom will be taken away. It says the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them. So when he is crucified and when he dies and when he is resurrected and then he ascends back into heaven, he's being taken away. So when the groom's taken away from them, he may be referring specifically to his death here, aside from his resurrection and ascension. That's the time when they should fast because it's a time for grieving. And he says, no, and then the garment and the patch. No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch tears away from the garment, and a worse tear is made. So unshrunk cloth is new cloth. An old garment is already shrunk, and so if you put an unshrunk patch on a shrunk garment, it's going to tear away. That's what he's saying here. He's talking about people who are not as well off as Matthew, and they can't always afford to buy new clothes, so they have to mend their old ones. And so they know that they need to take material from old garments to patch another old garment rather than a new patch, because the patch would adhere much better and won't tear away. And then he has the third analogy of the old wineskins versus new wineskins. He says, "Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. If it is, the skins burst and the wine is spilled and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, so both are preserved." So this really refers to the fermentation process of wine during those days. These wineskins were made generally from goat skins, and so new wineskins were able to accommodate the fermentation. Remember, fermentation is when the sugars in the grape juice, after they're pressed and preserved after a certain time, and sometimes it took some weeks, sometimes it took months, the sugars turned into alcohol, and then it would put out carbon dioxide, or the bubbles that are in wine, and so it would cause that wineskin to grow. Well, if you put new wine in old wineskins, the old wineskins are not ready for that, and so they will burst. New wine is put into fresh wineskins, so it has room to expand as the wine ferments, and both are preserved. What he's saying here is, I've come to not to do away with the law. We talked about that, but to complete it. He's doing that by creating something new, which is one of the commentators said, a radical departure from the legalism of the Jewish religion of Judaism at the time. The lesson writer here says, trying to incorporate the old trappings of ritualistic religion with the fresh spirit of Christ would damage both. Remember the difficulty that Paul had with the Judaizers. Remember, the Judaizers were the group that said, you know, you can become a believer in Christ, that's great, but to make it work, you have to be circumcised. And so Paul says, no, that's not how it works. We are believers by faith alone and not any other kind of works. That's what Paul says in Ephesians 2 8 and 9. So this particular section talks about what his work is there to do. What the it's not just about the mission, but the actual work. He's come there to fulfill the law and create something new. Then we, in the next two verses, we see a demonstration of Jesus' ultimate compassion. Verses 18 and 19, he says this: While he was saying these things to them, behold, a ruler came in and knelt before him, saying, My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live. And Jesus rose and followed him with his disciples. Now, there are parallel accounts to this in the other synoptic gospels, if you want to read them. They are more detailed than Matthew's account. Mark chapter 5, verses 35 through 48, and then Luke chapter 8, verses 43 through 56. I'm going to refer to both of those from time to time here. So while Jesus is talking with the Pharisees and John's disciples, or maybe just John's disciples, he is interrupted by an elder of the local synagogue. So remember, the synagogue is not the same as the temple. The temple is where sacrifices occurred. The synagogue was not like that. The synagogue was more for teaching and learning and reading the scriptures. Mark records this man's name as Jairus, or Jairus, however you want to pronounce it. In Mark 5:22 is what it says. It says in verse 18, a ruler, Jairus, came in and knelt before him. Now this word knelt. We've come across this word. We came across it last week. It is the same word that can be translated worship as proskuneo, but it may not be worship in this context. He may just be doing this as an act of respect, rather than falling in front of him and worshiping him. So he knelt. In any case, he knelt, which he is an elder in the synagogue, so he has a place of prominence. He knows who Jesus is. At least he has a pretty good idea that Jesus is the Messiah. And I've heard about this guy, and he is the man. He may have tried every other avenue you could think of, and Jesus is his last resort. Isn't that just like us? It's like me. We encounter what we might think is an untenable situation, and we try out every other solution except for prayer. This may have been Jairus' last uh, choice here. He knelt before Jesus, and he said, Jesus, my daughter has just died, or is in the process of dying, or she's already dead. And he believed, with the faith that he had, what, as small as it might have been, he believed that Jesus could bring her back to life. So what did Jesus do? Did he say no? Did he say, I'm sorry? No. It looks like they left straightway. But he didn't seem to be in a hurry. If we read verses, I'm going to read verses 20 through 22 here. And this is what happened on the way to Jairus' house. Behold, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. For she said to herself, if I only touch his garment, I will be made well. Jesus turned, and seeing her, he said, Take heart, daughter. Your faith has made you well. And instantly, some translation says, at that very hour, the woman was made well. Now, the Mark and Luke's accounts are much more detailed. Talks more about how she wandered through the crowd, and that Jesus said, "Someone touched my garment. I felt the power coming out of me," and so he finally sees who it is. I'm quite confident that he knew who she was. I think he may have said that perhaps for the benefit of everyone else around him. So they go into more detail, but this is essentially, Matthew doesn't really mince a whole lot of words. This is what happened. So um, this is an interesting point too that one of the commentators brought out. Um, her condition lasted for 12 years. This is what it says in verse 19. Whatever that condition might have been, and of course it probably refers to her menstrual cycle that may have been uncontrollable for some reason when it happened. And that had been going on for 12 years, and I'm sure she had gone from physician to religious person to religious person to try to get relief about this, and she couldn't. And when Jesus came through, she said to herself, this is the last resort that I have, just like Jairus probably was thinking. It's interesting that this condition lasted for 12 years. Jairus' daughter, according to Mark 5:42, was 12 years old. So all the time that Jairus' daughter had been alive, this woman had been going through this condition. It's an interesting little tidbit. He did not seem to object to this interruption. His faith convinced him to allow Jesus to control the situation. 1 Peter 5 7 says this. Well, let me just read through. Let me start in verse 5. Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that he may at the proper time exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him, because he cares for you. I think I've talked about this before, but um, the word for anxiety here means a divided mind. When we're anxious about stuff, we're trying to keep focused on what we're supposed to be doing, but on on this side of our brain, we've got this other situation going on. This is what Alistair Begg says about that verse, and I'm taking a little bit of chasing a rabbit here, but this man, this Jairus, I had to have been anxious, at least at some point, to some point. So I want to read here what Alistair Begg says about this particular verse. What are we supposed to do about this? The Bible nor Jesus does not say to us, forget about it. We are not to run from it. We are to cast them in humility. In verse 6, 1 Peter 5. This is the key to casting our cares, humility. The Greek word for humble in verse 6 is an imperative, a command. Bow down under the loving sovereignty of God in order that we might then turn to God with the things that seek to undo us. The word casting here, think of a schoolboy throwing his books on his bed on a Friday afternoon after school. It is decisive, energetic, and active. We are to cast all of our anxieties upon him. When I've read that before, I've often thought, well, does that mean the anxieties that I should feel because I'm a Christian and I've been trying to do right and it doesn't seem to work? That's also, does that count the anxieties that I've brought upon myself? And according to Alistair Begg, yes, it's all of them. It doesn't say throw just a few of your anxieties on him. It's all your anxieties. So that's what Jairus was doing here. He was casting all of his anxieties upon Jesus. Now in verses 23 through 26, we will see a demonstration of Jesus' power. This is after he's healed the woman with the issue of blood. Jesus came to the ruler's house and saw the flute players in the crowd making a commotion. He said, "Go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. When the crowd had been put outside, he went in, took her by the hand, and the girl arose. And the report of this went through all that district. When Jesus arrived, the professional mourners were there. It was expected, even in poor families, that they would hire professional musicians and mourners. We kind of still do that today. Sometimes we hire professional musicians for funerals, or we give a singer an honorarium. I've received that a lot as a singing at funerals. But there were also paid mourners, and they were making quite a commotion. It reminds me of the funerals of that day were much different than how we um, do them now. But in St. Louis, they wear white rather than black, and they're playing jazz. So that's a good I think that's a good analogy there. Um, so it says here that he saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion. So the word commotion here, or lamenting loudly, is what the Holman translation says, can also be translated uproar. They were making quite a bit of noise. It reminds me today of today's paid protesters. I'm not going to get into that very much, but I think you know what I mean. But they certainly were trying to earn their money. Now, whether they knew who this girl was or not, we don't know. It's entirely possible. And I don't mean to make light of this funeral because it's one thing when an adult passes away, but when a child passes away, um, that is very difficult. It reminds me of a time, it's been about 40 years ago or so. We had a family in our church who they lived across the street from the church, which is interesting. They they were marginally involved. They usually came on Sunday mornings, but they really weren't involved in anything else. They had two boys, and their oldest boy was named Chucky. He was Charles Jr. And they had just moved. They moved away from this house across the street from the church, and they moved out into the country. They hadn't been out there very long, and Chucky was bitten by a Rocky Mountain spotted fever tick. And in 3 days, he was gone. And we all knew Chucky, and we knew Brian, his brother, because they'd been to Sunday school and so on. And very very rambunctious boy, um, and it was a shock to all of us. And I remember that Chuck and Phyllis asked me to sing at his funeral. This is the first time that I'd ever sung at a funeral for someone younger than me that I could recall. And I remember standing up there to sing. I remember looking over at the family because they were over here. They were to my left, where the family was traditionally seated in our church building. And their family was just in beside themselves. I mean, crying and sobbing, and for understandably so. But Chuck and Phyllis had I've never seen such a look of peace and contentment on a pair of parents, especially in this situation. And from then on, their involvement in church skyrocketed. And I don't know that they did that, as a result of guilt or not. I think they did it because they knew where Chucky was and they want to be there with him. And I'm not doubting their Christianity, but I think that really spurred them on to be more involved. And eventually, Chuck became he went on staff as what was he the like the minister of administration. I think he was the business manager at a large church in Topeka, where Phyllis had gotten her doctorate in sociology and criminology and was teaching at Washington University, and so he got this job at that church. And they were there for I don't know several years before they both retired. But it kind of reminds me of that. I mean, where there were a lot of you know sobbing at this funeral, but then the parents, kind of like Jairus' parents, Jairus and his wife, this girl's parents, were they knew that Jesus was going to take care of things. So back to the situation here. So Jesus, when he got there, he said, "Go away." Now it's interesting. This word um, in the Greek is ekbalo. So remember, we see that in our parlance as ex, which means to go is out. The word exit means the way out. And balo means to throw. Um, so uh, parable, para is beside, and B-A-L-O, parabola is comes from the word balo, which means to throw in an arch like this. Another word that uses that is diabolo. That is a word that's often translated devil, and so that word dia is to divide. So we're throwing between, so we're dividing. The ekbalo means to throw out. So he literally threw them out of the house, and then told them that she was not dead but asleep. Now this is not. There, some commentators may say, well, this must have been that soul sleep. No, uh, she was dead, but what he was trying to say was that I'm going to raise her from the dead. Sleeping was another metaphor for death, but I think he wanted them to know that he was there so that she would not experience death fully. So it says then in verse 25. Oh, and they laughed at him. They scoffed at him. The word there, laughed, means to scoff or laugh against, is what the Greek actually says. He threw them out because they were going to be a distraction to the parents. So he went in. The parallel um, versions say that he was accompanied by Peter, James, and John. So either he, that could certainly, it certainly could be that way. Just that Matthew is he's much more concise in his description. He says he went after he threw them out. He went in, took her by the hand, and she stood up. Now in Mark's uh, version of it, he says that he spoke to her and said Talitha Kumi, which is an Aramaic term that means little girl arise. And so she did. She stood up. She was completely restored. It wasn't that she was just resuscitated from death, although this was a resuscitation. Remember, there's a difference between resuscitation and resurrection, and that resuscitation means that person's going to die again. Resurrection means we're raised from the dead to live forever. So this was the first of the three instances where Jesus raised someone from the dead. This one, the widow of Nain in Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 17, and then of course the most famous example, Lazarus in John 11. And something that I neglected to put on the slide here was in verse 26. The report of this went through all that district. So you know how news travels, in this case by word of mouth. There was a lot of mouths to speak all these words to a lot of people throughout. And would have been around the northern part of Galilee. So Jesus was getting a reputation. I'm not sure a reputation that he wanted. If you look at the verses, we read verses 27 through 30. He says, uh, And Jesus passed on from there. Two blind men followed him, crying aloud, Have mercy on us, son of David. When he entered the house, the blind men came to him, and Jesus said to them, Do you believe that I am able to do this? And they said to him, Yes, Lord. He touched their eyes, saying, According to your faith be it done to you. And their eyes were opened. Their eyes were made, he gave them new eyes. Those eyes were perfect. Jesus sternly warned them, saying, See that no one knows about this. But what did they do? They went away and spread his fame throughout all the district. And then if you go on, there's something I neglected to mention here. They were going away. Behold, a demon-oppressed man who was mute was brought to him. The demon had been cast out. The mute man spoke. The crowds marveled, saying, Never anything like this seen in Israel. The Pharisees said, He casts out demons by the prince of demons. And I think in Luke's um, account of this, I think it's in Luke's account. This is where Jesus confronts them. I think it's in this account where he confronts the Pharisees and says, "Well, who actually casts out demons?" And the Pharisees were thinking among themselves, if we answer this way, he's going to say this. If we answer this way, he's going to say that. So eventually they said, well, you can only cast out demons by the name of the chief demon, Beelzebub, or Satan. And he said, what you're doing here is blaspheming the Holy Spirit. You are attributing the power of the Spirit to Satan. That is blasphemy. And that, in Jesus' eyes, was the unforgivable sin. Uh, and then he goes out in verse 35. He went out through the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the gospel, healing every disease and every affliction. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like a sheep without a shepherd. And he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. And that's the rest of chapter 9. Just some summary statements here. We can trust that Jesus came to offer salvation to sinners. What did he say? I didn't come here to treat the righteous. I came here to heal the sick, not just from their physical illness, but from their spiritual illness, their spiritual death, really. We can rejoice in the truth that salvation is not based on religious works or rituals. It's not a check the box belief. Now, just remember that the spiritual disciplines are there not for us to say, okay, I did my Bible reading today. Okay, I did my prayer quiet time today. I did my fasting today. No, spiritual disciplines are there so that we can know God better. And if I can just say one more thing about this, because Dr. Whitney spends a lot of time in his first few chapters about the prescribed um, disciplines as opposed to the ones that are being made up these days. One of those is the maze walk, um, where you walk through this garden maze and meditate on whatever. That's not in the scriptures. So he talks about in that book the prescribed disciplines such as Bible intake, prayer, um, fasting. Journaling is one of those. It's entirely possible that the Psalms were David's journal. So, but those things are not things we check off. Now we can do that if it's a matter of, I have a goal here that I want to meet because I want to know God better. That may be the way to get there, but we're not doing it just to say we've done it. We can know that Jesus cares and will respond to our needs. We cast all our anxiety upon him because he cares for us. We can trust that Jesus has the power to transform lives, just like he's done with all of us. I also want to remind you of two things about miracles here. We talked about this a little bit last week. Remember that miracles um, were a sign for the prophets in the Old Testament and then the apostles in the New Testament of the standing that God gave them to proclaim his word. Remember, there were really only two periods in the Old Testament with Moses and Joshua around 1400 BC for about 65 years where miracles occurred. And then in about 800 BC with Elijah and Elisha, when they performed miracles, they raised people from the dead and they healed diseases. A period of about 65 years. And then a period of about maybe 70 to 100 years. Well, I shouldn't say that, like about 60 years um, from the life of Christ, the ministry of Christ, through to the death of John the Apostle, where miracles occurred, and then they occur no more as intended by God. So remember that these were a sign of Jesus' ultimate status as the chief apostle, the chief prophet, the chief priest, and king. And when Jesus healed someone, he restored them completely. When he healed the blind men, he gave them new eyes. When he healed Malchus's ear, he gave him a new ear. When Peter and John were used to heal the old man, the paralytic at the gate, his limbs, his body was completely restored. That's the kind of spiritual healing that we receive when we become believers. All right, so next week we are going to be in chapter 10, verses 16 through 20 and verses 26 through 34. and this is about loyalty to Jesus. So again, I will be gone. So hopefully John will be able to take over for me. I hope you're staying warm and staying well during this time of inclement weather. Um, and I'm hoping that I will get to see you sometime soon, week from this coming Sunday. Take care.